trip self-containment, so that people aren't having to make really long journeys every day to take their kid to school, to go to work. They have those options. Not everyone will choose that, but that's an important component. And the sustainable transport options, which I mentioned just a moment ago. So you've seen Taurara West before, so this is just to give you just an update reminder of that area, bounded by the Wairau River, State Highway 29. It's similar to the lakes area and the Taurara Business Estate in the sense that it's eminently developable, but requires some pretty large-scale landform change and earthworks. The ownership within that area is predominantly 3 large landowners. You've got the Hopping family in green at the northern end. In the middle there in blue, you have Classic Builders, Classic Developments, and in the red you have Taurara West Limited, which is in the same ownership as the Taurara Business Estate. I just want to make it clear that this growth area is a residential growth area, and everyone understands that. So while it's the same owner as the industrial area, they're not looking at doing industrial development. You'll see in there's a few properties that aren't coloured, so there's a range of smaller landowners within that area. And this is what it looks like, a range of views and photos from that area. You can see, for example, in that top right corner, some areas that look quite like wetlands. You can see the Wairau River in the bottom right there, but you can also see a range of pasture and generally quite nice contoured land that's suitable for development quite easily. This is Te Tumu looking from the Kaituna River back towards Papamoa and back towards the city. So it's around, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, Canberra, around 6 kilometres long and up to 2 kilometres wide. And you've got the Kaituna River on the left there, of course, and the Pacific Ocean to the right. In terms of ownership there, again, sort of 3-4 main landowners, 3 really big ones. Kaituna, starting from the left, working right, you've got Kaituna 14. It's owned by around 3,500-4,000 landowners. Sorry? Or up to 5,000 landowners now. Multiple owned Maori land, that's the key access through there is required. You've got the next block, which is the Carris-Hickson block, which is currently owned by TCC, but obviously the option for that joint venture to reacquire that land. And then you have Te Tumu 8B1, which is another multiple owned Maori land block, which is quite significant in size. That one's about 40 hectares. 30 hectares. And finally at the end there, the Ford family farm, which is one of probably the largest development block there. And a range of smaller landowners. Again, just some further photos for your interest. You'll see, for example, quite significant wetland areas in some of those. And that's the type of the areas that we're going to have to go out and reassess further as part of this new freshwater reform. And now it's over to Cam. So I'll let you take over, Cam. Thank you.
Thanks, Andy. I might just start off by just putting into perspective the size of those growth areas. So Te Tumu, Andy's trying to put into context of Te Papa, that's placing the end of Te Tumu being the Kaituna end, the Kaituna River outlet, from here to around where the old Gilmore's building used to be. Size, scale, shape. So when you're thinking about the conversations you're having about Te Papa, rapid transit, density, commercial areas, that's the same conversation you're having with Te Tumu. The other thing is, that's a growth area that is some 30 to 40 years to actually do its first wave of development. Okay, that's the scale we're actually talking about in terms of time frame. We are not landing a city, we are actually progressively, sequentially moving through that, which means that we actually have to provide for the present day cycles when you start with a view to the future. And you don't actually know what that future is, which is why enablement becomes a very important conversation, because you're running through a range of market considerations in that regard. Te Tumu is essentially about half the size, not 1/3 the size, and it may be around a 10 to 15 year development prospect, and does require significant state highway upgrades in which to enable that really to maximise its outcomes. Okay. The other thing is Taurara West has the benefit, it is surrounded by existing large residential areas and a large booming employment area. Papamoa does not have that. That has to be created at the same time in which Te Timu is doing it. So you're looking at, I've previously spoken to some councils before, and councils about all your levers. You actually have to be turning on all your levers to be delivering your community outcomes and your frameworks. If you were just relying upon zoning, regulatory frameworks without funding, you're not going to get the outcomes that you're actually desiring. They are using all of your levers. So the way I was going to structure today's conversation is essentially around building around urban growth principles and the principles that we apply to all our growth areas, irrespective of size. We've pulled up the Living Standards frameworks from Treasury. I think we'll probably hear more and more about this framework over time. But what this is really doing is essentially saying, hey, we're talking about people, in place, and over time. And we're thinking also about the intergenerational equity of the decisions we make today and how that applies to the future. Along the bottom is the idea of resilience. And that is resilience both in terms of its economic context as well as to other shock events that might be more in the natural hazard space. And we've largely got our 4 community outcomes or similar type outcomes being in there in terms of natural environment, the fiscal position, the way in which we're going to act in terms of our social capital, and the way in which we're going to put all of this together to deliver that new community outcome. Okay, so that's how I'm going to sort of talk about principles today. So as Andy's rightly pointed out, when we are applying these urban growth principles, we actually have a national legislative framework that we must give effect to. Whether we like it or not, that's the framework. And until it changes, and as we've talked about today in other presentations, it has changed from when we started these projects. And it will continue to change if we think about what a 30-year program looks like. Where we are today with Te Timu, that is 2, if not 3 district plan reviews. It will change over time as we see the change in market cycles and the evolution of what that community turns out in the first wave versus the varying stages as they move forward. Okay? It's not a static concept we're talking about today. It's one that we have to be able to move forward and use those plan reviews in which to keep up with the pace of what that community wants, as well as funding the needs of that community over that period of time. We also, when we're starting these projects, they very much are about understanding that landform and that place. And we'll come back to some of those conversations. So there's a lot of investment made around technical assessments that go into understanding that landform and what that place is about. And it's all about delivering the community outcomes you set and the envisionment of what they are in terms of those growth areas. There is a reason why Taurara West is largely a residential development. You've already delivered an industrial estate next to it. There is a reason why Te Timu has employment connected to a town centre with large sports fields and high density, because you don't have any of that, and we've got to create that through our zoning platform and the frameworks in which to deliver that new community. They need to be resilient to the future. We are not talking about the lower level sea level rise and climate change scenarios that we're applying to the present day existing areas of our brownfield areas. We are doing higher sea level rise scenarios. Okay. We are doing testing of higher populations. So when we talk about Te Timu, we're talking about 15,500 population. We are testing the infrastructure and the landform to cater to greater than that, so that we know if we see an uptake in greater densities, we can actually provide for that and continue to enable that growth. And that is a good thing, because then we don't have to find other growth areas. And it takes a long time to deliver these projects, both in terms of planning, but also in terms of rollout. And I go back to Andy's point, the lakes and the Wairakei urban growth areas were planned some 15 to 20 years ago. While we think that we are seeing rapid growth, that is built off the building blocks of those 15 to 20 years ago. So when we think about Te Timu and Taurara West, they will start slow. By the time we all sort of start thinking about it, we're seeing a booming of housing. They are at their end. Housing is the end part of the growth cycle. We are dealing always with the live, learn, work, play philosophy, and we are looking and working with our partners to deliver on those aspects. We very much have relationships with the Ministry of Education around making sure that we have the primary and secondary facilities close by in proximity, or providing for the connections within these landforms. And we are looking at an eye on sustainability. Very much a modal shift, walking and cycling, and thinking about the reduction in carbon. We need to also recognise our place in that space. and the policy direction that is in play, which is quite limited. But we know that the governments are working through changes to the building code, which is very much focusing on carbon reduction emission within the building industry and a focus towards sustainability. We haven't seen the outcomes of that building code work yet, but they've put out those proposals. And overall, we need to make sure that this is an integrated approach. We very much talk about the economic, being the funding and the commercial side of it, the environment and the infrastructure planning, and putting that all together. We don't have all of those levers right, we're not going to get the outcomes over time we're talking about. So when we apply those, we are focusing upon land use, transport networks, the infrastructure, and the resilience of that infrastructure. If we don't have the bones of these growth areas right, and we have a shock event, then we've got a community that doesn't actually have the service, and they should actually have the best practice standard because you're applying those retrofits to your existing areas of the city over time. When we're putting it together, we've got our social and cultural infrastructure, parks and reserves, all of the network of open space outside of your level of service. That is why when we show you some of the diagrams we're talking about, we've got large setbacks of riverside and coastal reserves, far greater than what we've normally delivered in previous growth areas. And it's all about the cultural and heritage lens and working with our tangata whenua partners on that. Christine and Andy do a lot of work with Kaingora and to try and create the connections of getting them on board and thinking about how they're going to provide for within these urban growth areas. But we also need to remember what we're not doing in the planning frameworks for these growth areas. From the prior council resolutions, we are not focusing on inclusionary zoning and affordability. They are your city plan issues. And we need to remember what we are creating in our structure plan and rezoning proposals today. See, everyone's looking at each other. What we're creating for today, you actually immediately are going into a city plan review. So if we zone to Timu and Taurara West today, come 2024, you've brought those proposals in, largely before the developments are even started. So you're bringing a cohesive citywide framework to those issues rather than just placing it in one growth area.
You know, so I was just going to just confirm the understanding on that issue. So these plan changes for these growth areas are expected to go ahead of the city plan review. That doesn't mean if we make some choices around, let's say, the issue of inclusionary zonings through the city plan review, then it couldn't then go and apply to Te Tumu or to Taurara West. That could happen, but we're not considering those as standalone work streams as part of this plan change, these plan changes. But we are, and we talk about it later in this presentation, looking clearly at housing choice and variety and at housing densities, and in particular minimum densities. So we are doing quite a bit of work on housing, but just not on those particular issues. thinking it might be, instead of waiting for questions all at the end, we might do them in stages as we go. So do you think
I can go that one.
it might be a good place to break right here if you would like
Thanks.
to do it that way, Heidi?
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah, so what was the thinking behind excluding housing affordability from rezoning planning work streams?
So we are, I guess it depends how you define housing affordability. The whole idea of providing more capacity is to try and address housing affordability at a very macro level through supply. And the planning framework that we're putting in place is going to be very enabling in terms of what can be built. So it's going to enable a lot of density, it's going to enable a lot of height, it's going to enable small homes to be provided, apartments, and those sorts of things. So it'll enable a lot of affordable housing to be built, but that will be up to the market to determine how much of that gets built, I guess. We are looking specifically at where we set the minimum densities and looking at certainly ramping those up significantly from where they sit in the city plan at the moment. The city plan, I think, are about 12.5, maybe 13 per hectare. In the regional policy statement, they're aiming at 15 as a target. We're going to be setting minimum densities as a recommendation to yourselves, well north of 20 dwellings per hectare, I would suspect, from the work that is underway. And we think the market is now in that sort of space to deliver. But inclusionary zoning and mandatory delivery of affordable housing is very challenging. And a report came through you in terms of the local government New Zealand remits some couple of months ago, and there was a remit around affordable housing, and there was a quite a detailed background report as part of that talked about the challenges of delivering that sort of framework under the RMA at the moment, which are very challenging, and no councils in New Zealand do that under the RMA. Queenstown have some quite weak provisions, but their large gains have been made when they had special housing areas and they had much more leverage. So it's a very challenging space to work in without any, I guess, reform at a national level in terms of a policy framework for us to work within. So we are considering that through the city plan review. And I think the other key thing is that we are really trying to engage a lot more closely with Kainga in particular, and the old ex-Housing New Zealand arm of Kainga in terms of making sure they're getting in there at an early stage, having those discussions and getting involved in delivery of public housing in these growth areas.
Sure.
So, yeah, and you mentioned something about the market being at around 20 dwellings a hectare would be achievable. That's currently, is that projected to change? Are they going to get better at delivering intensified living, and will that number increase over time, and can we review that number over time?
Yeah, so absolutely. So that number does increase over time, and it has increased substantively over the last 2 or 3 years, and we have to bear that in mind when we're putting together any minimum densities, that the housing development might not be starting for 3 or 5 years, so density will increase further. So we need to think about how we structure that, how that density might step up over time, and the city plan review cycle every 10 years is clearly one point that we can have a further review of that as well. So we need some really careful thinking about how we put that framework in place.
Any more questions? Oh, I've just got a question. In terms of
Developers, we don't deliver housing. Central government delivers a very small portion of housing, and then you've got some other players in terms of charitable organisations, things like that. So the housing has to be deliverable for the developer today. It's great to think about what might be in 50 or 100 years, but if the developer can't make it work today, it won't get built. So there's a need to push them and try and push them as far as we can, but there's also a need for it to be workable for them. And unless the central government or ourselves, and we probably don't have the financial resources to get directly involved, then it's really hard to influence those outcomes if they're not aligned with what we would like to see.
Supplementary, if I may. Sorry. Are we going to talk about amenity today in this, in the Tauriko plan, or is that because when we look at this, I'm trying to visualise this community, and I'm wondering how when we get to really unpack what this community is supposed to look like.
Yeah, so we've got still to cover the environmental side of things, the social side of things, the transport side of things. I think once we get to the end of it, you'll have a better picture of what it all looks like. You might still have some further questions. I guess part of it is what level of detail are we planning for? So we're doing a structure plan, which is, if you consider, a spectrum of high-level strategic planning down to real detail, like what you might see where you're planning, Wharf Street, we're still quite far up here. We're not down in the nuts and bolts of exactly what it's going to look like, and typically we wouldn't play a role there. We would set some frameworks and some provisions around design, but we wouldn't dictate and determine or do that planning at that real detailed level. But maybe we can come back to that point towards the end of the presentation.
Thank you.
So from an environmental perspective, we're looking at starting with that protection space, mapping out all of the areas that we know we should not be building on. And we've learnt that from the past, and we can actually understand why we shouldn't do that in the future. And so there's a full list of these things that we understand. The new MPSFM that has come in is requiring us now to go back and retest some of the assumptions we made, and it may actually result in changes to all the work we've done, if not cause some potential significant delivery issues. So that's a watching space as a key issue for us. But what we're really starting with is that protection. We're using our stormwater strategies and our integration with our open space to connect all of that together. And then through that, we are going to look to create features and points of interest within those. And as an example, we'll come to Taurara West about how the riverside margin we're envisaging to look at, because we're talking about setting some 20 to 30 hectares aside along the river margin. That is far greater than what is the expectation under the Resource Management Act, which is what you might commonly call the Queen's Chain of the 20-metre mark. Okay. We're trying to improve the current state of that environment in those areas. They are farmed areas, they are degraded, and we're trying to actually pick them up and improve that, and very much provide for improved water quality coming off those landforms, meeting our standards. So in terms of in terms of Te Timu, we produced this map actually back in 2016-17, and it's actually extremely relevant for where we are today. We have a coast, we have our river, and it puts constraints. We have a significant dune system in the extent of some 70 to 150 metres deep. That's a no-go area. We have the Wairakei stream corridor. That's a no-go area. We have all of our archaeology and our cultural and heritage sites, and along the river margin we have floodplains, wetlands, a significant grouping of heritage sites. They're all no-go areas. What this does is actually internalise growth into Te Timu rather than pushing it towards your coastal and riverside margins where the market might want it to go. They're excluded. They're reserved. That's part of the quid pro quo of providing for growth in this environment because of those values. In Taurara West, this is slightly more challenging because it is a different value proposition, but we are very much focusing on the river is the key. Stay away from the river, protect the river. There is a lot though going on in Taurara West which we're still to understand out of the MPSFM, because this growth area requires significant earth moving. It is on the scale of the lakes and the Taurara Business Estate. Without that, you've got no yield. Without that, you have no yield. We are required to significantly earthwork this landform. Otherwise, you're going to actually have to continue to open up more and more urban growth areas. This is heavily constrained and it requires that modification. The river is the key. Protect the river. So in terms of amenity, the ideas for Taurara West as some concepts that were put forward. This is very much around setting that development far back from that river margin. It is about creating and enhancing that riverside margin, creating walkways and cycleways. And the good thing about Taurara West, because of other projects, is that there's opportunity of connecting all the way along the Wairoa River. Because this has not been largely subdivided, you actually cannot get all the way through this growth area. You actually need that subdivision to create those connections. But you're significantly setting that development back, well off the first escarpment, and you're using and protecting those wetlands. And then you're delivering housing behind that and up on the ridge lines. So here's another perspective in terms of that significant riverside setback and those changes and providing for people in that space. We need to remember we're not saying that if you're in the space you cannot see houses, you want that passive surveillance. So it's not about not seeing housing and people, you've got that integration between the two. But this is a large recreation area and connection up and down the Wairoa River. Is there anything on environment? We can move to social. So when we go to our social thinking around this, it is about that safe and resilient and those connected communities. Okay. We need to remember the things that and the levers that we have in our planning and funding space at a structure plan level. From that social perspective, it is how are we going to zone and provide for the land resource that you require in which to deliver those community and social outcomes. That's our sports fields that you can then put your community halls, your aquatic centres and other facilities on. That's your funding arm of this conversation. Okay? The structure plan sets up the structure that enables you to then go and fund and deliver those things. It is all through your long-term plan. We are partnering with the Ministry of Education and have for a number of years been working with them on high school and primary school delivery in these growth areas on different land tenures to try and get them into the space of actually recognising the difference between Taurara West and Te Timu. It is a positive outcome to be able to put these school and education and even tertiary facilities on the Māori land. That is the aspiration of those trustees. But that requires some thinking around managing long-term leases and investment in those areas. And we're coming through in our zoning rules and creating that enablement. We want to create a land use plan that shows and guides where the land uses go with our partners, but we need to zone to recognise it doesn't always go that way. The Ministry of Education is going to be bound, not by a zoning process, but from an engagement with a landowner perspective. So they need the flexibility to be able to go in a number of locations. What we're wanting them to do, though, is align with how we are seeing our main road corridors and where the best locations are for them to create an integrated community. In Taurara West, as an example, a primary and secondary school is also going to be catering to a large rural community as it does now, as well as that new urban growth. Where in Te Timu, it's very much about providing for that existing corridor. So we want to place them beside our parks, and our reserves, and our rapid transit corridors and roading corridors. All right? So the other thing that we're doing is that we actually try and analyse what is the base case population and future growth populations to think about what are the services that we might need to provide and ensure that there is some framework to enable those activities to come here. So in relation to Taurara West as an example, we have 3 scenarios. We have a very low growth scenario, which we call scenario 1, scenario 2 being 3,000 and scenario 2 and scenario 3 being high growth. We can then, based upon those populations, think about how many early learning centres we need, how many primary schools and what the size of that is going to be, how we provide for our activity or town centres or small commercial convenience centres. In Taurara West, we do not need a lot of convenience. We've got Tauranga Crossing. The two can't compete, and we're not going to create that competition because we're running a centres-based approach in the city. All right? So, but we don't want to create a situation where you don't have a local convenience centre provided. So we need to create the framework that actually requires someone to deliver that at one of the transport corridors to create for the connection and also provide for the activity. And we need to size that accordingly and have the expectation that when people want to come and deliver that service, that it's available and in the right location. Is there anything on social?
Thanks, Kelvin.
Thank you. So just to go back to that slide, please. So at what point do we choose a specific scenario that we want, and what informs that?
So the way in which we've been doing it is working out what is our developable yield going to be, and therefore the thinking around your densities. It is actually, we can pretty much pinpoint how much land you need based upon a growth area for a commercial activity. It's not so easy to tell you where it goes. Into Timu it's far more easier because we actually have a rapid transit corridor and we have a range of connection points which will be part of the structure plan. In Taurara West though, we're going to be building probably from a south and a north with the connection in the middle. And so what we're really thinking about is outlining our base population needs, how much GFA needs to be provided, and the qualities that need to be provided within those areas. And then as the landowners are rolling out their master plan, we are part of the choosing of where that location actually sits. Okay? Because until we actually start seeing that master plan, which is a vastly different level, much lower down than what Andy's talked about, which is a developer-led approach, we need to see how that goes to actually make sure we've got the right location. So in one of the plans in time for Te Timu, we've pinpointed where we think the best ones are for what we know today and how the development will roll out as our example.
Anyone else got any questions? I have another question. This is a developer-led approach, and we've seen developer-led approaches. This is sort of you as demand happens, they open up more land, and then more land, and then more land, and so you kind of get you get the sort of, you end up with this kind of development that happens a little bit like it has happened down the end of Papamoa over time. What is the opportunity for this to be a working with developers together with Kaungurua to say, okay, so what does this look like? What do we want to achieve? What does government want to achieve for housing density? And then at what timing do we put out amenity? Because if we were to put out amenity timed in with developments, then that's what drives the developer to want to do the kind of density, surely, that it's like Hobsonville Point works. You put in the schools, you put in everything together, and the development happens at the same time because people want to move there because the amenity's already there. But if there's this kind of lag and amenity going on through and finally we get our sports field, we never get that kind of density. And then we're sort of back to the drawing board when we actually, Tauranga's run out of land 30 years down the track.
I'm going to start. I'm going to take over. So there's two parts to that conversation for me. There's what council's going to do and how it's going to fund. And then there's the other part, which is what is the expectations on the developer and how are we going to integrate and work collectively. So the first one's quite simple. You need to develop your long-term plan in alignment with our timing projections, and you need to have the facilities there ready. If you're not going to be able to put that level of service in, that's a problem. Sorry to be blunt.
Yeah,
I was going to say the second part. Or you want?
I just you're referring to the libraries and the
Yep.
sports fields and the things that we.
The second part, the one.
I'll just pick up on that. So you had the workshop the other day with Ross Hudson on the community facilities, and that was all aligned to what community facilities do you need across your entire network to provide for growth. And you recall he talked about community facilities in terms of libraries, aquatics and community network facilities in both the Eastern Corridor and Taurara West. So that's absolutely what's happening, and that's what Cam is referring to. That work will flow into the LTP for prioritisation against other investment decisions that you need to make as to where you want to invest and how do you want to prioritise both the balance sheet and the rate spend of this community going forward. So that covers that bit.
Just what is the opportunity for us to partner with, and I'm not saying because we won't be able to roll out the kind of amenity that will create the kind of density that might enable us not to have to go back here in the future, because we don't have any money. So if we were to go with government to actually go together, have we done that? Are we looking at that? I know that you're talking about us partnering over time, but as an intentional development that isn't led by developers but is a contiguous development, what does that look like?
Yeah, so I think you're referring to partnering with government and agencies to deliver facilities early. Is that? Yeah, if I get that right. So if we look at what the government will deliver in these growth areas, I'm thinking primarily it is just going to be schools. I can't actually think of anything else. There might be some co-investment of the DHB in some privately owned medical facilities, but their I don't know, their influence is not actually particularly large. But obviously to get things going, massive amount of transport investment is required from the central government. There is, so coming out of UFTI, so with UFTI complete, the next stage is to continue working with government officials on a cross-agency, whole of government approach around implementation, and probably with a focus on our priority development areas, which if you look at it from a Tauranga perspective is Taurara West and Te Tumu. So the idea is that we form some way of getting together and working collaboratively with central government to make sure that they're taking it from a whole of government perspective rather than from just a single agency perspective, because it may well be the best thing that we get that high school in there on day one. Or if you look at Te Tumu, maybe the busway built on day one, and that might mean, it might not work ideally for the Ministry of Education or for NZTA in terms of their funding streams, but it's the right thing to do from a more holistic perspective. So that really is, I think, the next focus for us to get some way of working like that up and running. But I think I think Christine might want to jump in and talk to that. But I think the other point we need to just pick up on in this conversation is who is delivering the infrastructure within these growth areas, and Cam can talk to that in a minute, because that is really critical, and that is a space where we're stepping away from just because of affordability reasons. And I'm not talking about the soft infrastructure, the social infrastructure, I'm talking about the hard infrastructure, the roads and things like that. Okay.
And just off that, I was just going to say, so we've actually drawn a line around those growth areas, and everything outside, TCC is responsible for delivering to the boundary in the hard infrastructure. We are not responsible for delivering any of the infrastructure within it. They need to meet our standards because it will be vested in us, but your balance sheet doesn't allow you to interact in that space. So it's actually, the risk is on the landowners, and they've actually all got to collectively work together through a funding agreement in which to invest, because everyone leverages off the first stage of all those developments. The second thing, in terms of amenity, in terms of some of the other outcomes we're seeking, the proposal that we've put to those landowners is different from how we've run our previous growth areas. So we've zoned and walked away, or you've zoned and you've done some horizontal infrastructure. You certainly haven't been delivering community infrastructure. Knowing that might occur and carry on, what we're trying to do is set up a framework that is outside the city plan, where the council and the developers can come together to master plan at the landowner's stage. So once we set the structure plan, each individual landowner at their time of development will actually go and develop a master plan, and then off that they will develop a staging plan, and then a subdivision and plan, and then that's when they'd come back to council for their regulatory approval process. Now we get a little stage, we've missed that bigger snapshot. We are proposing to enter into contracts that actually require that as an integrated part of the development. It's a non-statutory kind of agreement, it's about a design and design principles, and that would have a team wrapped around it with a project lead, finance, levels of service from open space, infrastructure planning and regulatory compliance. The carrot for those landowners and those developers is essentially that if everyone gets buy-in at that front end, while they're developing that process, the consenting process comes extremely quick, because you've resolved all of your issues rather than actually being created and they come later. And that's where the pathway around what does the design look and feel of parks, open space, riverside reserves comes into play. And that contract is about setting up those expectations early on.
So
Thanks, Andrew.
just going back to the previous question around, the council does not have the balance sheet capacity that it needs to deliver on the NPSUD requirements in terms of the quantum of housing supply, and it doesn't have the financial capacity to do all of the lead infrastructure in terms of bringing the community facilities on stream well in advance of the development. While that's acknowledged as being best practice in urban delivery, we just don't have the capacity to do that. So there's two things that are in train to start to have that conversation at a city level with your community about the challenges of that, and with central government. So the 1 July resolution that this council passed in parallel with Regional Council in Western Bay to do a piece of work on what is the gap between what we need for the city in the sub-region and what we can afford, and then how might you be able to breach that gap. That was signed off, and that piece of work has gone to market. The preferred tender has been selected by the three chief financial CFOs, so by Paul Davidson and his equivalent and the other councils, and that work is underway to try to identify how we might be able to address the gap. It's not probably going to give us the answers for the LTP, but possibly for subsequent LTPs. And the other approach that this council, through the policy committee, signed off was the approach to this next long-term plan for Tauranga City Council was that we would effectively do two long-term plans. One would be a prioritised LTP within a rate and debt envelope that this council, by majority, agree is the level that you want to set for the community. And the other is what would you need if you were going to deliver on the housing and social and community needs of the city over the 10-year period. What would that look like? That provides you a mechanism to have a conversation with the community and with government about the gap between the two things, because you are unable within the LGFA requirements to deliver on all of the fiscal needs of the city. We know that. So those are the two tools that we've proposed as executive team and you've supported moving forward. So what we're trying to do is to deal with those big picture issues. At the same time, the team is continuing to move forward with all of the urban growth planning across brownfields and greenfields, and have that moving at pace with the intention that at some point this will come together. But it is a huge jigsaw. I don't know if Marty wants to add anything.
The first one is, how is amenity scored? Like, is there a weighting? Is there when you look at an area, do you add up a whole lot of numbers and you've reached the amenity target? Or so how do you work out when you've got enough?
What we're actually doing is setting aside what is going to not be able to be delivered and developed, and then like your escarpments, like in the lakes, they're being planted out, and we're actually setting aside the riverside margin. We've used that from a landscape, cultural and heritage perspective to set that aside, and then creating those concept images for that delivery. And that's sort of your green space delivery. In terms of your sports fields and your neighbourhoods, etc., they're delivered out of your level of service that you've set. And then from that, you're then working, I suppose, in terms of your road corridors and your other levels of service out of your IDC and your funding tools for, if you had one, for social infrastructure, for your community halls, etc. So there's not a weighted attribute kind of table that we work on. It's actually an output of the wider design of the growth area.
So that comes to the second point, is that we're not a very big city, and from Tauriko we've got a 20-minute drive to one of our best amenities, which is Mount Beach, and to any number of boat ramps and things like that, which when people decide to move to the city, they don't move here because of the community hall or the local sports grounds necessarily. It might form a part of their decision, but most people move into the city because of the beach and the water access. It's if it was just about sports parks and stuff, people would move to Hamilton, and of course a lot of people do. But I just don't see us factoring in things like access to boat ramps as an amenity, or access to the whole of the Mount Beach as an amenity. And we seem to be trying to create a whole lot of stuff within a local area with our level of service, which we still need, but we're focusing on that when I think we've got some other things that we can call amenity that we're not using. It just never comes up in our conversations.
So just picking up on that, so when we had the workshop the other day on community facilities, we talked about a two approach, a by approach if you like. One was a citywide network level of service, and at that stage we were talking about community facilities, so we talked about things like aquatic facilities like Bay Wave, which are superior facilities that provide a citywide level, and then we talked about local facilities like the Otamoto Pool, and the same with active reserves are citywide, and then you've got your local reserves. And it's no different in terms of the beach environment. So within the level of service policy, it absolutely does recognise the beach and the coastal area, does include boat ramps, etc. All of those things are in there. I suppose what we're doing is we're bringing slices of it. That's just too big to bring you the whole picture in one go. What the team are talking to here about is structure planning at a local level, but that sits within this context of network-wide thinking in terms of the whole of the city. So your points are valid, but we need to be working at both levels, not just one.
And when we're working locally, this is this live, work and play concept. Is that because we're spending a lot of time on that. And the evidence suggests that people, when they have these things, live, work and play in their local areas? Or do we do this despite what people want to do with it?
Yeah. So
Yeah, it's never going to be perfect, but for example, from an education perspective, it's live, learn, work and play now. So the learning part is really key. So if you get the schools local, people will tend to go to those local schools. In terms of the working, it's about creating those really large employment areas. So you've got, in the Western Corridor, the Taurika Business Estate, Tauranga Crossing. There's going to be upwards of 10,000 jobs there when that's complete. So that provides a good opportunity for a good portion of those people that live in the Lakes or Taurika West to work there. Not all of them will choose to, but that's important. As opposed to another strategy where we put all the houses on this side of the harbour and all the jobs on that side of the harbour, that's clearly not going to function as well. So, obviously it's about how well you can implement that strategy and how far you can take it. It's never going to be perfect, but given our constrained transport networks, it's critical that we do as well as we possibly can to deliver live, learn, work and play. Yes, so through the transport model that will measure trip containment. And so we've done modelling, and it's of course just modelling, but modelling putting in all our land uses, say in the Eastern Corridor, and modelling what a full build out of that looks like. And so if you take the Eastern Corridor, 50% of trips within Wairaki and Te Tumu are likely to be contained within that area, and over 90% of trips will be contained on that side of the harbour. So it's really minimising the amount of cross-harbour trips, which is where your key transport constraint is. So it's indicating that we've got more or less the right mix of land uses out in that part of the city.
Any more questions?
Yes, I don't want to get too much into the weeds with this, but how this issue, the level of service issue, and reference was made by Christine Jones to aquatic facilities and the recent discussions around that. Do we benchmark? Does anyone know how many aquatic facilities, for instance, Hamilton City Council runs?
So my understanding is, I'm not across the detail of this one, sorry, is yes. So the needs assessment that was done by, and I can't remember the name of the consultant firm who've done it. Sorry, it's gone. They did look at benchmarking across. I think we mentioned the other day we had that session that in terms of library, we tend to be behind in terms of book stock and space and staff per capita, which is one of the benchmarking measures. So we do look at that. In terms of the active space and passive space, there are sort of generally accepted standards. We did some leading work probably 5 years ago, and that's now been picked up at a national level. So yes, there are benchmarks. There is generally accepted best practice that continues to evolve, and our staff keep connected to that as it moves forward.
And the only reason I mention it is that a quick look at Hamilton City Council website suggests they have 2 aquatic facilities in the city.
I think our general view is that we are not well endowed with community facilities, and we are, that's been an issue in terms of council's constrained balance sheet for some many years, and so it's an ongoing resource prioritisation by elected members about how you want to use your limited resources.
They also only have a duck pond to swim in. Oh yeah, I grew up on that one. Is there any more questions from the floor?
We've got about another 5 or 6 slides.
Great.
Okay, so we've actually talked about I've touched on some of these points already. So we actually are running across the city a centres-based approach. You're actually building around your centres, and in Taurika West, it's around building around the Tauranga Crossing and the large employment zone. And to Timu, we have to create that. Okay. We are, in doing so, providing for all of those connections, walking, cycling, bus priority, if not rapid transit, to those centres. And when we're putting all of our work together, we are focusing from an economic perspective on the feasibility. Now, it's a model. It's one of the inputs into understanding the consideration of how we put these growth areas, but we do not want to create a design or an outcome where the feasibility model does not show the opportunity for the developer to want to enter into it. Otherwise you'll get nothing. They will only enter it when it becomes feasible for them to do so. And we have quite complex financial models in which to help us understand that. Once again, it's an input, it's not the overall decision maker. And we are working, as we've talked about, on our infrastructure funding and how we work with those developers in terms of who is paying for what and how, given your balance sheet capacity. In terms of transport, as I said, it's all about that connection, but there is a now and future conversation, no different than how you're applying it into Papa. So we are looking at what we need to now and what the current framework is, but we're looking to future-proof all of these corridors. They are wide corridors that may not be built on day one, but it actually provides the city the opportunity to translate those as that community gets built and gives you the opportunity. The corridor is very much significant to how you want your city to grow over time. There is a significant shift towards of modal shift, walking and cycling infrastructure in all of these growth areas. That is connected on the main roads and through a network of off-road walking and cycling connections. For Te Timu, it's very much focused around a transit-orientated community because of such the size of that growth area. We're in Taurara West, it's about providing for bus priority at a range of connection points to get the bus through those intersections faster than the cars. And then, as we've talked about, it's the walking and cycling connections to the coast, the reserves, sports fields, the riverside margins. And we're looking also at how we're going to integrate travel demand management within that to shift our reliance upon cars into using those other modes as well as the self-containment. Sir.
Question, John?
Outside pricing, what does travel demand management mean?
It can mean such a number of things, but one of the critical ones is around your land use, right? So it's about getting your land use density up. That supports public transport. It supports having more local facilities so that people, more things are viable, so that you don't have to make those outside movements. And it's about getting that land use in the right place. So if the bus route's here, you don't want to put your density over here. You put your density here. So there's a huge component of land use within travel demand management. But we're actually working up, and I'm not over the detail of it, but we're working up a travel demand management sort of strategy for Taurara West, and it's actually a critical part of getting NZTA over the line in terms of their investment. But it can go down to simple things like travel plans for schools or for large workplaces, and maybe encouragement or subsidy schemes for e-bikes and those sorts of things. So, yeah, many things.
Key thing to all of this is the integration with Waka Kotahi. Significant investment, Papamoa East Interchange, the road and corridors, including funding out of Waka Kotahi for the investment within those road and corridors like Te Timu. And for Taurara West, it is about state highway upgrades. They are critical to be able to make these developments work.
Can I ask one question? So Taurara West Mall is the local community shopping centre for this new development. How far is it from one end for them to get to their shopping?
No. Can I check? It is
Yeah, sure.
what you might call the metropolitan centre or the large town centre for this wider western corridor. We're providing for a local convenience centre within the growth area. Okay, so that's like your Foursquare, your Fish and Chip, GPs, early childhood centre. Okay, but you are needing to leave, so it's about 2.5 kilometres from the southern extent to Tauranga Crossing through a network of walking and cycling, bus transport priority. Okay. We've already talked about that creation from the structure plan down to the master plan, and then using these key drivers around the accessibility to those areas, safe and efficient movement, and delivering that multimodal corridor. Okay, that's trying to achieve a range of benefits and balance that overwards. But I come back to that environmental and cultural perspective. It starts with that protectionism space. What we also have in terms of our housing, we've also talked a lot about that, and there's actually work specifically going underway in terms of housing You've done Plan Change 26 today, which is providing for that housing choice, which is the springboard that provides for the delivery within some of these growth areas. And we are undertaking specific research at the moment around different policy options and what the feasibility is over time towards delivering more and more densities, which is coming back to you in a future perspective. The NPS has changed the way in which we are thinking about the delivery of height within these growth areas, however. Because in Te Timu we have a rapid transit corridor, we're automatically at 6 stories. So when we're putting this together, while I've called this a structure plan, it's actually a hybrid of almost every single piece of information we have on this growth area. It is a diagram, it is not the implementation master plan. But the way in which we put these together is we have our main corridors through our spine roads, and there are 2 of them in this growth area, supported by our large employment centre, sports fields, and the opportunity for primary and secondary schools. They are all located towards that centre because you're building mass and greater opportunity. And along your rapid transit corridor, this is where you are providing for your density, your schools, your reserves, and future commercial zones as you move eastward. You can see everything that is green on this is set aside. It's a protection space, it's to be zoned reserve, okay? So these are the way in which we put together. We also build into this plan a local network. We're not mandating that, it's put here to help us understand that the land that we've created is potentially developable, is actually able to be developed. And we understand what the yields may be, because as you move towards the fringes of your constrained land areas, you might end up needing larger lots. So we want to understand what that might mean in terms of our density of delivery. Okay. So we build these plans, these are our land use plans, a structure plans, and a constraints plan to give us an understanding, and we build the underground infrastructure as a layer within that so that we know we can service this and stage it. In this growth area, it is a west to east trajectory. In Taurara West, it is actually a north and south, and it will be built and then connect up into the centre. That actually has some better outcomes, because you will probably find as that growth area moves towards this way, its density will largely be in the central corridor. Where in Te Timu, it's across the main stem between these 2 roads up into here, because that's where the height can be absorbed. Because when you think about Te Timu, it's got a range of large catchment that you can see across. You've actually got to manage your height within that landscape. Oh, no, it's all right. I'll carry on. Oh, jeepers. Okay. I'll do these last 2.
I'll do it.
No, it's all right. You go. Sorry, I need to run pretty quickly. Just in terms of our timeframes, these are complex projects. They are well behind. We acknowledge that. We're actually running into a number of challenges in both growth areas, and that is largely because of change of the legislative framework and the investment and the engagement we are needing to do, specifically for Taurara West, it's NZTA, and Te Timu, it's our engagement and our multi-land issues and how we overcome this. We've got certainty. We are heading towards a progression of a late 2021 notification. We have to try and achieve that date, because otherwise we start to merge into the city plan work, and we don't want these 2 things being progressed at the same time, one before the other or both at the same time. We are in the space though of now moving into, now we know what our pitches look like and how the thing can be put together. How are we going to create the rules to enable the delivery of that? For Te Timu, we are below 50% developable land from where we started. Okay? It's not a bad thing, it's just the reality of putting this all together. The MPS freshwater management is a turning point for us. We are going to have to go back and retest a lot of assumptions, which may have a cascading effect on the delivery of that time frame. And that is in both growth areas, and may significantly affect our developable land or the investment we've made in all of our stormwater planning to date. We haven't done a lot of engagement in both growth areas for quite a period of time, and that needs to start up. For Taurara West, it needs to align with NZTA's program for the state highway, so we're at a hold point for that. And for Te Timu, there is a range of court processes in play, and we're not really wanting to engage until there's a clear understanding, because that is what has been requested by us, by our iwi partners. And then there's working through how we're going to invest in that infrastructure and how our developers are going to come and form those contracts with us, which is always a significant one, because you're now dealing with who's paying for what, when and how. Largely the same applies for Taurara West. Those same issues we've talked about are in here, but it's very much coupled with where NZTA are going to go with their business case process and the commitment of that board afterwards to actually designate a corridor. The actual road and corridor and its designation is key for us to justify how we deliver Taurara West over the long term. It may not stop us from starting it, but actually will have an implication for its long-term delivery.
So, questions? Calvin? and then
Yeah,
John.
thanks, Cam and Andy. When it comes to Taurara West and the alignment of State Highway 29, presumably the only option they've got is to sort of go more towards the river, right, which would be cutting through that land. Is that correct? And therefore it limits the amount of developable land, and then presumably NZTA has to negotiate with purchase of that land from the landowners. Just how does that all work?
So, because you're talking about private land and discussions with NZTA, we're happy to cover that in the closed section, but it's not a conversation we can have in the open.
Any more? We're all good? Are you finished?
Yes. Was that we had presented quite a lot of work around Te Papa, around the full well-beings and how we'd assess Te Papa, and there were a number of questions from elected members around how are you planning greenfields and does it cover the full well-beings. So we said we would bring something back to you once we'd got the plan change work. So really that was what this was, to show, to demonstrate what the depth and the extent of planning that goes into a greenfield area, and it's really is only a very quick overview, but it hopefully has given you a bit of a feel that it's more than just roads and wastewater pipes. It is definitely a more holistic way of planning urban growth areas.
Further question, John?
Comment from you, Christine, on timescales, if I may. 2006, we were talking to people in Te Tumu, and we wound up entering into an agreement because we saw what was coming. So the planning for that space effectively started way back then. We saw what was coming. We're now nearly 15 years down the line, and we've had changes come through in the last 12 months that mean we're going to have to go and review a significant amount of the work we're doing. So there's two ways of phrasing this question. One is, how do you guys sleep? And do you get any? But the more pertinent one is that how do we get ahead of this? Because we know it's caused issues with the developer. We know it's caused issues with tangata whenua. We know it's caused issues with our community. It's caused issues with our transport system. We're 15 years in. Where an enormous amount of money has been spent in this place. How do we get ahead of this? Or is this just the world we live in?
Probably two answers for that. I think the timeline, while we did enter into agreement in 2006, is slightly different. So in 2006, the landowner of the day had a rural zoned residential resource consent approved, and we were able to proceed. And the council was looking to protect the urban future of this area so that this plan that we're talking about now could happen, and that there wouldn't be a footprint on that would significantly affect the ability to get the required desired density. So from a strategic point of view, the acquisition did that. Through the smart growth document, there was always the advice from staff that Te Tumu should not have been indicated as being planned until 2021. There was a decision made on the back of a submission to have it in the smart growth strategy for coming to the market earlier than that. And there were provisions that were put into the regional policy statement which talked about the hurdles that needed to be met for it to go out of sequence. So it was never, the planning from a technical point of view had never anticipated that Te Tumu would come on stream prior to 2016, even though the agreement was entered into 2006. So yeah, hopefully that covers that. But I think so that sort of moves your timeline from 15 years to about 5 years. That's not to say that your point's not relevant though, but it does shift it. And these processes are hugely complex, and I think what we will say to you is that the framework that we need to work within today is so much more difficult than the last urban growth area which were planned, the last two, which was the Lakes, which was signed off in 2006 from memory, and the Wairiki plan change, which was some few years later, but not yeah. So we haven't actually, these would be the first areas, that greenfield areas that were planned under the current framework, and in that intervening 10 years, you've got tangata whenua have moved from putting all their investment and resources pretty much into the treaty claims and dealing with those issues, so they didn't have capacity to engage in future thinking for the city. They were working in another space. They are now have got more opportunity to engage, and that's really important. You've got quite a different landscape in terms of the urban policy statements and quite a little different landscape in terms of government policy statements around transport, etc. So the whole thing has shifted hugely. Will deliver better outcomes, but is much more complex and time consuming to work your way through. So we do need to put more, I mean, the ideal solution is put more investment into the planning earlier, but that comes up against competing against the other demands that you need to choose about how you allocate your resources, because again, you come back to there's a defined, how big you're going to define it, but it's still got some sort of a cap on it of your total funding envelope, and how do you distribute that?
If I could, Sarah, if I could just jump in and just add to Christine's comments. I think the key here, and if you look at other councils and areas that have been successful in providing sufficient land supply, Hamilton, and more recently Auckland through the unitary plan review, is that the first stage is to get your land zoned, right? And if you go back and look in hindsight about what we possibly could have considered or should have done when we zoned Wairaki, is we possibly should have zoned Te Tumu at the same time, and things would be a lot easier. And this is what they've done in Hamilton. You can come back and refine that later. It doesn't mean it all gets developed straight away, because there's still some big decisions around infrastructure funding. But it's almost like, if you look at the CIP process, ready to go infrastructure, if you've got something that's truly ready to go, which most of the projects that most of everyone put forward weren't, you're really likely to get some money, right? So if you've got your land zoned, it's a whole lot easier to unlock the other bits and pieces associated with it. So that's a real focus. And if you look at our city plan review project plan, that's the whole idea behind it. Not just in the greenfield areas, and including Ohawiri South and Keenan Road and some of those areas that might take quite a long time to unlock, but also in the intensification areas as well, in the Otomotais and the Mount areas. So we really need to get ahead of the game in terms of zoning, and then that will help us unlock everything else that we need going forward. But that's the first step, if you ask me.
This was mentioned in there somewhere. And is there again, two ways of phrasing the question, how little of the costs we put into growth management have we been able to recover? Or another way of doing it is central government, because they want us to be in this space and we all see the need to be in this space, is central government looking at the ability to recover more of the cost, or maybe even contribute something very much at that front end? So forget about funding or a balance sheet to go and do something at this end, but all the way back. Is anything happening really in that space to change that?
So a couple of things. So in terms of central government, no, there's no discussion around central government enabling the money that we're spending to be developed to cover from, say, development contributions or something like that in a similar way as infrastructure. That's not there. In terms of central government having capacity to contribute specifically to these urban growth areas, planning limited. So Andy talked about those priority development areas that we're in discussion with central government about setting a working team up or structure. We just haven't landed on what it's going to be called and look like yet. They will bring their resources to the table in terms of their people and the expertise, not likely to bring cash to the table that we could use to fund all the technical analysis that has been demonstrated to all of the work that needs to be done in each of these areas. So that's unlikely. They may bring small sum of money to the table to partner in smart growth in terms of contribution to the overall smart growth costs, and they've indicated that they're looking at that, so that's the extent of that. And I've signalled to Māori that I'll be bringing him a proposal for further resourcing so Cam talked about the timeframes of 2021. To get there, we're going to need to put more concentrated effort in than we currently are, and we're going to need more resources to do that. And that's important because we need to get those plan changes done so they don't then clash with the city plan review of 2024. They really need to be done and dusted. One, to get land supply, because clearly we've got a housing crisis. And two, so we don't start merging RMA processes and end up in a right pickle. So that I've signalled to Marty that that will be heading his way with a request for additional funding in this financial year to move that faster than we currently are.
Can I just ask one more question around Kaingora and the provision of social housing in that new development. In what space is that sitting? Is that with our community, with the homeless strategy, or who's got the ball on that conversation and opportunity?
So that's something that Marty and I have been in some conversations with, and Andy and I met last week with an advisor. We're looking to how you can put a package together on those issues. So there are some opportunities, and you'll recall from a recent meeting we had with them, they are very much interested in these urban growth areas. So we are looking at what we can do in that space. Through the last Smart Growth meeting, we've agreed to move towards a housing plan at quick pace, and Kaingaora are keen to participate in that, and that's going to help inform their work. They were going to do a separate one, and now they're going to merge, and we're going to do a collective one for the Western Bay sub-region. So that's going to go to the 21st of October Smart Growth meeting as well. It'll be covered in the quarterly in the update report from Ken Tremaine. I don't know if you want to add anything to that, Marty.
Well, I think Andrew McKenzie, the Chief Executive of Kaingaora, is here next week to, I think, have conversations about opportunities and potentially partnership opportunities with us.
Great. On that note, if there's no, if everybody's ready to party, if there's no further business, I will declare this meeting closed. Thank you, everybody. This is quite a historic day and a good reason for us to celebrate and thank the council staff for all the work that they have done around these plan changes. It hasn't gone unnoticed. Tina, what was that? Oh, we have a council meeting to go. Woohoo! But would people like a 10-minute recess so that can be set up? Well, we need to set it up anyway. 5 minutes? Okay. Thanks.